Go.
Hi, my name is Jessica Taylor, and this is my final communication project for Human Services, Class 508. First slide is the introductory slide. Go ahead and turn to that. In this presentation, I'm going to be giving an introduction of what I've learned so far in this class as this class comes to an end, my overarching life and communication goals, my background and behavioral blend, the barriers and interpersonal context, and then how I'm going to deal with these barriers, and the plan of action with my goal in mind for improving my general communication. Next slide. The overarching goal that I have made for myself throughout this class is that I want to communicate in a deeper, more effective manner with the purpose of enhancing my intimacy with those who I'm in conversation with. So basically the rest of this presentation is going to keep relating back to this goal of enhancing intimacy as well as improving communication skills. Next slide. My personal communication beginnings were a little bit difficult to come up with, but as I was reading in the Stewart text, I found a quote that I think pretty accurately describes how I feel about the beginnings of my communication. He's quoted on page 94 as saying, being comfortable with ourselves is basic to acting comfortable with others. And basically I grew up in a family that didn't really know how to communicate. Communication was who could speak the loudest, and I spent a lot of years being uncomfortable with myself and my own communication as well as how I was presenting myself. And I erred on the side of the spectrum where I was more people-pleasing instead of pursuing an authentic type of communication with others. I was pursuing approval of others. So as I grew and I matured, I realized that communication was taught to me, but that I had a choice in how I facilitated that communication as an adult. And I had a choice in taking those things that I learned from my past and moving them into the future, not letting them affect me negatively. And this realization helped me develop who I am, but also helped me to see where the barriers of my past are and where my poor communication skills and places can still use work. Next slide. We were asked to talk a little bit about the background of ourselves as well as the behavioral blend and how that comes to play in our communication skills today. I chose to focus on the negative first just to get it out of the way. I'd say the first thing that comes from my background as well as my behavioral blend is that I tend to be a highly emotional communicator. So my emotions are right there at the surface. They're very tied into what it is I'm saying as well as what it is I could be hearing. That's very tainted by whatever my emotional state is. So I recognize that as a barrier. Next, I think that along with that, my feelings can take over my logical communication at times. And so instead of looking at something rationally, again, a lot of those feelings and a lot of those communication issues are tainted with how I'm feeling at the time. Next, I have a hard time seeing others' perspectives, especially because in general I'm very logical, and so I see things the way I see them, and I've usually thought them out, and so it's really difficult to have an opposite perspective come in and to be able to look at that objectively and see how that can blend into my already set into motion plan of what I want to do. And then lastly, for the negatives, I feel like there's always been a winning and losing mentality, that especially when it comes to conflict and argument, it's somebody wins and somebody loses. And I've learned through this class that actually the goal of communication should be to communicate, which means both people are winning. Even if the outcome isn't what I expected in the beginning, I realize now that it's not one person walking away winning and one person walking away losing, that's actually a losing conversation in general. So moving into the positive, the things that my past as well as behavioral blend have taught me, Because of the past that I came from, I know that I worked harder to develop those skills that I have now. Taking classes such as communication and group dynamics, I've been able to see better how people are communicating with me and how I'm in turn responding to them. So I've worked a lot harder to develop those skills. Next, I'm listening more with intention. Instead of just hearing what somebody's saying, I'm really trying to understand the meta message behind what it is they're trying to tell me, as well as focus on their emotions. Next, I also think that I know myself better, and as I continue to grow, that's a positive aspect of my communication. And lastly, I am more able to listen with empathy. Coming from a behavioral background of not being listened to, I feel that it's even more important to listen to people with that empathetic listening without my own agenda on the line. Next slide. Next, I want to talk about barriers to interpersonal context, and I want to read a quote from Stewart, page 43. Interpersonal relationships serve as arenas for developing or damaging social skills. They are rolling laboratories in which the levels of skill found in relationships at one point in life help determine the level of skills in relationships at the next point. The reason that this quote really stuck with me was because I saw what he was saying about how we can develop ourselves or we can damage ourselves, and that our past does play into how we treat people who we're communicating with in our future, especially if we're not intentional about changing those negative communication patterns from the past. So when I looked at my interpersonal context, I began exploring what were some of the biggest areas that I struggled with, and my two most difficult barriers were conflicts in relationships and differences among the sexes. So we're going to move to the next slide. This conflict in relationship became a barrier in my personal communication because I didn't really know how to have effective, positive, and productive conflict. And a lot of people in my life were so used to being in a state of conflict that they created problems to feel comfortable. So I found that at times I began to look at the negative and create problems as well, when what I was really seeking was human interaction and communication. So having these ongoing conflicts in a relationship can be a huge barrier to effective communication and to personal growth. Next slide. The next barrier that I found that was really interesting was this barrier of gender or communication among the sexes. And part of my overarching goal was to communicate and develop intimacy. And I find that especially in my relationship with my husband, that developing intimacy comes from a basis of good communication. And these communication differences needed to be explored, and compromise needed to happen for me to understand how better to communicate with my husband, and really just anybody with an opposite perspective, but especially with the opposite sex bringing in those meta messages and those backgrounds that I don't personally understand as a woman. Next slide. Next, I kind of talked about some of the solutions to pollution, noise pollution, internal and external. The internal pollutions that I kind of saw as the most pressing were guilt and shame complex, and I see that we can combat that with grace and redemption. I saw people pleasing as one of my personal pollutions, and I saw that love and personal understanding is something that can really bring you out of that. Another is the feeling of not being enough, and the solution to that is letting God reveal your identity. And then lastly is that my own thoughts internally can distract me from listening, and the solution is I can intentionally listen. The external pollutions, one, I can be distracted, and the solution to that is that I need to choose to focus. The second one goes back to that emotional state where your words might be hurting me, but I can look at the meta message as a solution. What do you really mean, and are you meaning to hurt me, or is that something that I'm interpreting? Lastly, the thing I wanted to say was that when I'm multitasking, which I'm usually doing, then I'm not really listening. And so I need to combat that with the solution of listening is my only task, instead of trying to perform these other tasks under the veil of listening. Next, I want to talk about the plan of action for interpersonal communication. It basically takes work, and the best way to put your ideas into action is to create a plan. And so that's what I've done. Next slide. The importance of listening to the self. So Stewart has a quote that says, plots of every communicator's story are built around self-maintenance because self-worth is always an issue in communication. So I realized that you have to remember to listen to your internal thoughts and your internal processes in order to communicate effectively. It's also not easy to be objective in conversation because we have our own backgrounds and ideas. Next slide. My next plan of action is finding common ground. No two people are going to want exactly the same thing at the same time. When I read this, I was able to see that when I'm in conversation with somebody, I need to be able to start from the same perspective that they are, whether or not I agree, so that I can better understand the place that they're coming from. This also can help me in issues of conflict or in debate, which is different from discussion, so that I can understand what the opposing side is and better create my argument. Next slide. My next plan of action is opening my ears and my heart to the conversation and investing purposely in the conversation. Stewart says this begins with an internal decision about how you're going to invest your time and energy. Here it helps to recall the distinction between spending time and investing. Most of the time, I'm not allowing myself to be changed and to grow when I'm just spending time and not actually investing in the conversation. So this is my next plan of action, is to invest better in the conversation and to make the choice to invest so that I can then get something back from it. Next slide. The more you concentrate on the process, the more positive will be the outcome. This is a quote from Stewart, page 221. My next plan of action was no more in one ear and out the other. Rebecca Schaefer reminds us that mindful listening is important to any type of communication, and I have to be mindful in the conversation and the process of effective listening in order to make the best of the conversation. I learned that hearing and listening are two very distinct and different things. When I'm just hearing, that's the physical phenomenon of sound going in my ear and me processing it, but when I'm actually listening, I'm processing on so many different levels. And so this last step is no more letting things fly through, but really taking the time to process and invest in the conversation and in the person that I'm speaking with. Next slide. My last step in my plan of action to look at my overarching goal is seeing eye to eye. Productive conflict interaction results in a solution satisfactory to all and produces a general feeling that the parties have gained something. This is a quote from Stewart, page 446. I need to feel like I can see someone else's perspective as well as my own. And this is my last plan of action, to be able to feel like I'm communicating with the purpose of communication, with the purpose of intentional listening, and with the purpose of coming out with a general outcome that both parties can be happy with. So, in conclusion, I want to allow myself not only to listen fully to the progression of communication, but also to improve and to grow in my communication skills. And to recap, I want to do this by beginning to be aware of myself and my biases to the information in the conversation. I want to be able to start the conversation aware of the perspectives that I'm going to be representing, as well as those that are going to be represented to me. I need to be able to listen more fully, and not just with my mind, but engage with my heart, so the other person feels the empathy that I'm trying to relay as I try to communicate. I need to remove mindless hearing and remove that from my conversations and constantly move into active listening. And lastly, I need to strive to end conversations seeing eye to eye with the person, regardless of if I leave the conversation agreeing with them, so that we can both grow mutually stronger in our active listening and communication skills. Last slide is references, and these are from the text that we've used throughout this class. Thank you for listening to this presentation on interpersonal communication. God bless and have a great day.